afternoon. I think it's important to give you some context in terms of why we're doing what we're doing and to give you some background. 5 years ago, Relisha Rudd disappeared from the DC General Hospital shelter, a place where mothers and children experiencing homelessness should have never been housed. We do not know where Relisha Rudd is today, but her spirit is alive and well in this room, as well as children who are separated from their parents along the US border, and too many other children who've been exposed to adversity on a continuous basis. This colloquium, as you see in your program, is dedicated to Relisha and all children who have not been able to experience just being a child. Relisha's disappearance was the major reason that caused the faculty in the School of Education to re-examine our social justice efforts. And we joined forces with the people, some of whom you're going to meet in a few minutes. So we joined forces with those who are doing the work, who are out there in the field. We also learned about the original study funded by Kaiser on ACEs, on adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress, and the impact of the long-term impact of prolonged exposure to adversity and trauma. ACEs is the public health issue of our time, and we have decided to be a part of that movement to inform and prepare our future teachers, school administrators, and mental health professionals to be ACEs and trauma-informed and responsive. So next we will have, is our Kaiser person? Okay, that's what I was hoping. We will have a welcome by Laura Howard.
Good afternoon. My apologies for being late. I actually had a lovely 20-minute PowerPoint presentation, but I won't waste any of your time because I doubt I can tell you anything that you don't already know. The one thing I will say is for Kaiser Permanente, I work in our community health department. Our role is to do public health, improve the health and wellness, and we have a particular focus on youth and schools in reference to the amazing study done on ACEs. So I did a little research on that, and Dr. Folletti was the one who worked with the CDC on that study. And so where it started, interestingly enough to me, is that in 1985, he was the head of preventative health for Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. And everything that he kind of touched was gold in terms of health and wellness, but he had started an obesity clinic, and he found that over the past 5 years that 50% of the people going through the obesity clinic were dropping out. And there didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason as to why. And so he wanted to find out, why are people dropping out of this clinic? So he created a series of questions that he could ask that were standardized, things like, how much did you weigh when you were born? How much did you weigh in first grade? How old were you when you first became sexually active? And so on. And so he brought together a couple hundred of the dropouts and did face-to-face interviews. And so in one of them, he asked the question, but he misspoke. And instead of saying, how old were you when you first became sexually active, he asked, how much did you weigh when you first became sexually active? And so the woman, answered 40 pounds. And so he was kind of baffled. And then she confided in him that at the age of 4, her father had abused her sexually. And so Dr. Folletti said that in 23 years of practicing medicine, this is the first time he had ever encountered incest. But as he continued to do these interviews, he found more cases of incest, of sexual abuse, of sexual assault, and other trauma, and realized that the obesity that these people were suffering wasn't necessarily the issue. It was a result of the trauma that they had experienced as children. And this was their coping mechanism. And so later on, about 10 years later, partnered with the CDC and then did this major study where they interviewed 17,000 patients and identified the different areas of trauma. Now again, I won't bore you by going into it because again, you probably know far more than me. However, I will say that it's something that we at Kaiser are really proud of, that this is work that even though it happened 20 years ago, it's kind of fascinating that it's just sort of coming to the surface now. One of the things that we're doing as an organization is we've developed a portfolio of supports in schools that we call RISE, or Resilience in School Environments, because I'm sure, as you all know, one of the key combatants for ACEs is building resilience and building the capacity for resilience, and that the way to do that is by supporting not just the child, but the community, the school, the local government, and so on, and that it really has to be a group effort. And you all in this room are the current and future leaders of that work who are going to make that happen. So again, don't want to take up too much of your time, just I'm thrilled to be here on behalf of Kaiser. We are thrilled to be able to support and sponsor this amazing and really critically important event in education. And so look forward to hearing from you and learning from you in the future. So thank you.
We very much appreciate Kaiser's support, and we will be continuing to ask for more support in the future as we proceed with this endeavor. And that's one of the other things that, that I do want to state is that we are hearing a lot. Trauma-informed and trauma-responsive is trending. But this is not a trend for us. This is something that is ongoing. This is something that we will be continuing with because we do understand how impactful this is. One of the things that we have done, because I see one of our partners from BCRA, Caitlin, if you would raise your hand. Caitlin is with the Building Community Resilience program out of GWE, the Kellogg, is it yes, okay. And these are people who invited us in, and we were so glad to be invited in because they are the people that are looking at the pair of ACEs. So it's not only about the individual, the child, it's also about the community. Because one of the things that we do need to be concerned about is that as much as we can prepare our teachers and our counselors to be trauma-informed, ACEs and trauma-informed and responsive, if we are putting them back into communities that are not there yet either and are not resilient, then there's a problem. And so it would be easy for us to say, okay, well, we're putting teachers out there, we're putting counselors out there, they know what to do, and these other systems, won't accept what they, what they should be doing. But that's not really getting at the problem. And so we needed to be with a group, as many of our other partners that you will meet today, who are really serious about this, that this isn't just going to be a fad, it's just not going to be a trend, and that we move, to, the next issue, like as an example I give is the Whole Child movement. We had Whole Child, we had social emotional development, and you cannot have social emotional development if you have not dealt with ACEs and trauma. And so that is what we are about. And so in your packet, you will see information from Child Trends that has put out a very good definition about ACEs and trauma, because a lot of people will say to us, oh, this is about, you know, not just trauma, because, you know, trauma, we would like for, you know, for people not to have traumatic events in their life, but all of us are going to have traumatic events in their life. But we did want to educate ourselves and other people about what this initiative, what we're really talking about in terms of ACEs, and why it is a public health movement, and why it is a public health issue. So next, we will have John King, and I think we've advertised enough about him in terms of his stature as former Secretary of Education, and I'll turn this over to Dr. Taub to give a more formal introduction.
So it is my distinct honor to welcome Dr. John King Jr. to Trinity, and also to this conversation. We actually spoke with Ed Trust, Dr. King, and several of his colleagues at the very beginning of some of our work this year, and one of the things that he said that I felt was so important was the idea that ACEs and that trauma-informed and trauma-responsive could not become the next excuse for why our marginalized children do not do well. It could not become the, well, there's nothing I can do. They had adverse childhood experiences. And that, to me, was one of the most important pieces that I've kept in my mind as I continue this work and as I do this work, because I do work with the students who are most marginalized, the students with intellectual disabilities, the students with communication systems who don't yet have a full communication structure. And so it's a privilege to be able to bring Dr. John King Jr. to the conversation for the rest of us to hear and learn more. He is, as Cynthia said, the president and CEO of the Education Trust, which is a nonprofit organization that seeks to identify and close educational opportunity and achievement gaps. There is a plethora of information on the back tables from Education Trust. They have some very nice papers and white papers that they have published that are very interesting, especially if you're in education, but even if you're worried about your community or want to think about your community, with topics such as what are Black teachers' attitudes and experiences in the schools, right? A very important piece of this. He served as the U.S. Secretary of Education under President Obama, back when things were a little happier. Prior to that role, he carried out the duties of the Deputy Secretary, overseeing policies and programs related to pre-K through 12 education, including English language learners, special education, innovation, and agency operations. He joined the department following his post as New York State Education Commissioner, and he began as a teacher. So he really has the whole picture of what it's like to go through public education, what it's like to teach in public education and charter schools, and what it's like to continue on through the layers of systems that do make up our schools. So with that, I welcome Dr.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I am grateful for the opportunity to join all of you. Thank you for that warm introduction, and grateful to President McGuire for inviting me to be a part of this conversation, because this issue of adverse childhood experiences and how we as a society respond to the challenges and traumas that our children have experienced will shape the future of our country. This is an incredibly urgent and important issue, and I want to start really by thanking all of you for the work that you're doing, whether you are doing research work or working in an organization that is on the ground trying to support kids, families, educators, whether you are working to address the underlying causes of the adversity students face, or working to prepare teachers to effectively support their students. I'm grateful to you for the work that you are doing, and grateful that you are committed to doing that work in community with each other, so we're continuously learning from each other. I want to try to situate our conversation in the deeper context of this work, which I would argue is really about really seeing our children and what they are bringing with them into the classroom. And I'm very passionate about this issue because for me, if not for educators who really saw me, I wouldn't be standing here today. I wouldn't be alive today. I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Brooklyn. Both my parents were career New York City public school teachers. But both my parents passed away when I was a kid. My mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. My mom passed in October of my 4th grade year. After she passed, I lived with my father. My father was quite sick with undiagnosed Alzheimer's. And he got more and more sick, and then he passed when I was 12, 7th grade. During those years, the thing that saved me was New York City public school teachers. When my father was sick, one of the things that happens with Alzheimer's is you just lose your connection to reality over time. And so home was this place where I didn't know what my father would be like from one night to the next. Some nights he would talk to me, some nights he wouldn't, some nights he'd be angry, some nights he'd be sad. I didn't know what was wrong. I didn't know why he was acting the way that he was. I can recall one night he woke me up 2 in the morning, told me it was time to go to school. I remember being on the staircase in our house, holding on to the banister as my father pulled me on the stairs, and he said, "It's time to go to school." And I kept saying, "No, Daddy, it's not time to go to school. It's the middle of the night." And he was so insistent that it was time to go to school, and I didn't know why. And that's what home was like, day after day. As he got more and more sick, I had to take on more and more responsibility in our house. I remember being incredibly hungry at home because after a while my father stopped going to the store. There was no food in our house. I remember being so hungry I had to figure out how was I going to get food for him and for me. And I knew that he had, one of the things with Alzheimer's is some of the patterns in your life, you keep doing them. And so he had kept going to the bank every week to get cash, even though he didn't spend it, even though he didn't go to the store. And eventually he stopped, but there was all this cash in his room. And so I remember the day I was so hungry and I had to decide whether it was okay to go in his room to get that money in order to get food in our house. And I remember feeling so guilty and so bad about taking this money. I felt like I was stealing, even though I was hungry and neither of us had eaten. That's what home was like. But the thing that made all the difference was that school was this place that was nurturing and supportive and engaging and challenging and interesting. I had a teacher in 4th, 5th, 6th grade, Mr. Osterwald, whose classroom saved my life. He looped with us, which was very unusual in New York City public schools, but for those 3 years, he was like a surrogate father. He was the kind of teacher, you finished a book, he was there with the next, you finished a math problem, he was there with another, it was a little more challenging. We did productions of Midsummer Night's Dream and Alice in Wonderland in his class. I was the Rose in Alice in Wonderland with big red felt petals sticking out of my head, right? But I remember all those things like it was yesterday because his class was so meaningful for me. One of the great blessings of my life was that when I was sworn in as Secretary of Education, I was able to have Mr. Osterwald come and be a part of that ceremony. And it was important to me for him to be there just to, in some small way, thank him for the difference he made. Right, but that's what educators all over the country are doing for kids. And he didn't know all the things that were going on at home for me, but he knew that it was important to create a classroom environment that was loving and supportive. But I also don't want to make it seem like it was a straight line. You know, sometimes people tell their story and people assume that it's all neat and tidy. Mr. Osterwald saved my life. Miss D, my 7th grade social studies teacher, saved my life. And When I got to high school, I was angry. Like many young people who experience trauma, I was angry. I was angry at my parents, irrational though that may be. I was angry at adults. I'd moved around different family members, different schools, and I got in trouble, a lot of trouble. So much trouble I got kicked out of high school. And I always tell folks I'm the first U.S. Secretary of Education I've been kicked out of high school. But I hope that I'm not the last, right? Because part of my story is that there were a set of educators and mentors and a school counselor who were willing to see me as more than the sum of my mistakes. They were willing to believe in me even more than I believed in myself. They could very easily have looked at me and said, here's an African-American, Latino male, family in crisis, resistant to adult authority, what chance does he have? And they could have given up on me, which is what we do with so many of our young people today. And they could have given up on me because of bad decisions I made at 16 and 17. But they didn't. They gave me a second chance, and that made all the difference. So this work, this conversation about adverse childhood experiences isn't just an academic conversation. This is a life-saving conversation. This is about what are we going to do as a community to support our young people who are most vulnerable, and how do we invest in them. So I want to close with three thoughts about things we have to be careful of. And one came up in the introduction, which is we've got to be careful in a society where so many assumptions are made based on race and class, in a society where implicit bias is present in every classroom in America. We have to be so careful that trauma and ACEs don't become a new excuse to assume that students can't. Right? We have to be careful that we don't end up with those faculty room conversations where someone says, don't worry about that kid, there's no point in trying. He had 7 ACEs. I mean, what could we really do here? And that danger is not insignificant. I have already heard it. Right? And we see that around the language around socio-emotional learning as well. I had a friend who was telling me about a teacher colleague who said, yeah, my kids this year aren't gritty enough. Right? And so, what can I really do? Right? That becomes then about blaming young people and about a deficit frame for young people. So we have to be vigilant that does not happen. Second, we can't just look at the things that have been hard and difficult for a kid. We have to also look at their strengths and the things that they love. One of my favorite programs that we worked on at the department is one of our Investing in Innovation grantees, a program based out of Minnesota, started by a school counselor, called Building Assets and Reducing Risk. And what Barr does, a school counselor who said, I'm worried about low-income kids, kids of color, immigrant kids in my school who aren't graduating. So she went to her principal and she said, can we meet as a teacher team with the counselors, talk about individual kids, what they need, and develop a plan for them that builds on their assets. Right, so yes, it's about intervening, yes, it's about addressing why they're struggling, but it's also about building on what they love, where they are strong, their favorite class, their favorite activity. We've got to be careful that we don't let an ACEs trauma-informed frame mean we only look at the challenges a kid faces, not the strengths that they bring. The third piece is, I want us all to be trauma-informed, and I also want us to build a country where there's a lot less trauma. I don't want any of us I don't want any of us to get comfortable that mitigating adverse childhood experiences is enough. What we ought to be doing is preventing them. We have a system of mass incarceration in the United States that takes people away from their families, that uses a punishment frame as we approach incarceration rather than a rehabilitation frame. So we have millions of young people who are separated from their families, often needlessly, by a system that we have built. That's not the kids' fault. That is something we're doing as a society, and we need to dismantle that system. We have young people in this city who are homeless or moving from home to home, underhoused, because there is an inadequate supply of affordable housing. That's not a kid problem, that's a system problem. If a kid comes into class hungry, Because we live in the richest country in the world, but we can't figure out how to make sure that everyone has access to food. That's not a kid problem, that's a system problem. And so we have to be very careful in this work, that we, even as we work to make sure that schools are responsive to the trauma and the adversity kids have faced, that we continue every day as educators and as citizens to work to reduce those sources of trauma and adversity. And think about the kids, the babies being separated from their mothers at the border. Babies, small children being held in cages. That's trauma that we as a society are inflicting on kids and families. So do I need the teachers that will teach them to be prepared to support them through that trauma? Yes. But do we need to change our politics so we stop inflicting trauma? Absolutely. Right, so as we talk today, I want us to do everything we can to make our schools places that are supportive and nurturing for every child, but I also want us to work to make sure we build a society that is supportive and nurturing to every child and family. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be with all of you today.
Thank you so much for those invigorating words. So we are now ready for our panel, and if the panel members would come forward and be seated. Dr. Lou Oprea will be facilitating this part of the program, and she will introduce our panel members, many of which we consider as a partner or as a part of our ACES network.
Good afternoon. I am very excited to have this panel of professionals. And as some of you all may have read in the program, their biographical information, and I've also read their profiles on their websites. And I was so impressed because what I saw that they did, where they are first responders in preventing adverse childhood experiences. And I'm really humbled by the work that they have done, because they're behind the scenes too. They're not just out front. And they're listening to our children and families, and they're finding ways to work and collaborate with them so that the children and families can find ways to heal through their trauma. So I'd like to introduce our panel. To my left, you just met Mr. John King.